Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and this is episode 179 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I'm here with Mike Uli in the studio. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me, Alex.
Yeah, so we are actually just a little over a week out from the NRA annual meeting, almost 2 weeks out now, I guess. We attended in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Georgia World Congress Center. And this year was a little bit unusual for us because it was our first time attending as press, so to speak. We were one of the voices of the NRA. They called it Media Row, where they had a collection of various podcasters and media people recording either live or doing pre-recorded shows there from the show floor at the World Congress Center. So we're here today to sort of recap our experience at the meeting and as press there as one of the voices of the Second Amendment. So with that being said, Mike, I think we did a recap last year. Of course, we went to the meeting in Dallas last year. First, I want to talk a little bit about what your impressions were in terms of, I think, attendance and sort of the environment or the vibe, so to speak, at the meeting as compared to last year and maybe the last few years, because as many people know who have been listening to the podcast for any length of time, there's been some inner turmoil at the NRA, lots of restructuring going on, partly as a result of internal efforts and partly as a result of external force or coercion through the courts and through the case that the NRA has been involved in New York. Let's talk a little bit about the meeting itself, the attendance, at least our perception of it, and a few of the other things that you observed at the meeting.
Well, I think, as you point out, it's probably good to start about and talk about the context a little more broadly. Before the 2024 meetings, there was a lot of negativity surrounding the NRA, mostly brought about, well, I shouldn't say that, but focused because of Letitia James, the New York Attorney General's lawsuit against the NRA. First of all, I think I need to say I'm no fan of Letitia James whatsoever, period, full stop. Nonetheless, that litigation brought focused on a lot of the shortcomings of the NRA over the last many with respect to stewardship and leadership and management, and regarding fiduciary duties with respect to managing the money of the NRA, the members' money. So the NRA had been in decline in terms of membership, in terms of contributions, in terms of political influence. And last year, there was a movement between what I call the old guard. I think other people characterize it differently. The old guard, led by what had formerly been Wayne LaPierre's leadership at the NRA, and what I call the reform movement. And I think that's a pretty universal coin. I think it's last year I felt better about the NRA. Like I said, their membership had declined. I was, for instance, in my case, I'm a life member of the NRA and have been for a long time, but I hadn't been contributing any more money to the NRA contributing to the NRA. My money was going to GOA and FPC, the Firearms Policy Coalition, and some others, Second Amendment Foundation. So there was this general decline of the NRA in terms of influence and money. But I think last year was an improvement. The reform candidates who basically want to correct the indiscretions of the NRA over the last several years gained a lot more influence. I don't think they were completely in charge. I think there was maybe some concessions from the old guard because they saw what was going on. I felt better about the NRA after, in terms of its potential direction. I think you need to think of the NRA like this aircraft carrier. Somebody said, it takes several miles to turn an aircraft carrier around. To a certain extent, I think the NRA is like that. But the positive thing is, I think this year, 2025, last month, we saw even more improvement at the NRA. We saw the reformers get a majority on the board. And I think the reformers are now clearly in charge. I don't know if I'd call it a super majority, but certainly a majority. We saw the board of directors go in the right direction. The only old guard position is the secretary, Mr. Frazier, and I think he has probably limited influence given his position as secretary. So I think things are going in the right direction. I was very encouraged. There are a lot of great board members out there that I think are doing the right things. I was encouraged. It seems as if there is even some debate within the reform community on certain things. For instance, this year, there were some resolutions introduced by Ronald Andring, and I think you're going to have him on later as well, but there's a little bit of controversy even within the reform camp. And I think that's a healthy thing. So it's shifted from a debate between the old guard versus the reformers. The reformers have almost assumed control now, and there's some healthy debate about how to go forward with respect to the NRA within the reform camp. And I think that's a good thing. With all that said, I think I know you've been this way and you can talk about it. I think it's time for folks to think about rejoining if they let their membership, if they were an annual member, and let it lapse. And I think folks probably should support the NRA at this juncture for a lot of reasons, which we can talk about.
I think that, like you said, last year with the reform candidates elected, there was, of course, the four for reform, and I had Jeff Knox on the show on a couple of occasions to talk about the four for reform who were running last year, and that I think that sent a signal to the membership that at least some of the bleeding had been stopped at that point when those members were elected, but the balance hadn't changed enough for the reform candidates to really have enough traction to make the necessary changes, at least not quickly. And like you said, it's sort of like an aircraft carrier and trying to turn an aircraft carrier because the organization is so large. But I think part of the issue is not that just that it's so large, but that the board itself is so large. And that was part of the problem to begin with, was that Wayne LaPierre was able to basically insulate himself by creating a board that was basically a buffer for him and his actions. And it took a long time to change that balance because the board is such a large board. There are 76 members on the board of directors. So there was this change of balance with the board, and then there was this sort of change of balance with the officers, the leadership last year, but there was still a lot of conflict. There was still a number who were part of the old guard. There were some new who were more reform minded. But then this year, like you said, not only has the composition of the board changed, the officers, the leadership that were elected as a result of the board meeting on Monday after the NRA annual meeting is now mostly composed of reform-minded people, with the exception of Secretary John Fraser. So, which is mostly in a ministerial position, as far as I know. It's not one of the more influential officer positions.
Yeah, and now Mr. Hamlin, who took over Wayne LaPierre's position as the executive vice president, I think he has a freer hand now to do what needs to be done to get this ship completely turned and headed in the right direction.
Yeah, and as you alluded to, many people have let their memberships lapse. I was a 5-year member. I actually had intended to purchase a life membership back in 2019, but that's when all of these indiscretions and lack of transparency and extravagant spending on the membership's dime began to be revealed. And so at the time, I took a step back and said, hey, I'm not going to give my money to this organization if that's what's going on. I didn't know for sure that that's what was going on at that time. And of course, this litigation in New York revealed that much of the allegations were true, and that hopefully some good comes from not only the case in New York and the oversight that's been implemented as a result of that, but also now the election of the reform-minded board members.
Yeah, and those it's Amanda Suffolk. You mentioned Jeff Knox, who I'm a real fan of, have great respect for. His father obviously not obviously, if folks can look that up, but was involved in the NRA historically and trying to make some reforms. You had John Richardson on, but these are folks that I think many, as you mentioned, there are 76 directors. These are folks that are going to have a very positive influence on the direction of the NRA. And there's a perfect example of when I was talking about, I think, the debate is now within the reform camp. For instance, should there be 76 directors? I think absolutely not. There's no reason to have 76 directors in this organization.
Zero.
But the reform folks, I think there's some debate. You're going to have Ronald Andring on. We talked to him about how many directors he thinks there ought to be. And I don't remember what he said. You can ask him. But, I will probably disagree with some of the current board members that there ought to be 30 directors or 20. I absolutely see no reason why the NRA
to have more than 10.
Yeah, I mean, Apple, well, depending on what the stock market's doing, the largest multi-billion-dollar corporation, I think they survive with 8 or 9 board members. And some folks will tell you, oh, the NRA is more complicated. No, it's not.
No, not even close.
Not even close to running Apple. That's a reflection of the fact that you don't understand Apple, is what that is. So there's no reason. But the problem will be you've got 76 board directors. Which one's going to step forward and say, I don't want my position anymore?
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like in
Mm-hmm.
Congress, them voting for term limits.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah. Get a politician to say that they want less power and less influence. That's hard to do. But I like the proposal that I've heard some people make, that the 76 member board should in large part be converted to an advisory group, not a board of directors.
But as I say, that's a healthy debate. Let's
Yeah.
somewhere between 76 and 8. Okay, let's have that debate, and that's a good thing for the NRA.
Right, exactly. So getting back to the point, though, about membership and whether it's a good idea now for people to part with their hard-earned money to support the NRA, I get why people, and I'm still in this camp, why people might not want to join as life members. But I think there's been enough change at this point that people may want to consider at least re-engaging as an annual member, because the NRA, unlike these other great organizations, by the way, GOA, FPC, SAF, and others, they have massive influence, and they still have 3 to 4 million members despite the significant loss of membership. And that's a powerful mechanism to help influence politicians and in supporting the right to keep and bear arms at the national level and at the state level. So the NRA, not only for its lobbying and legislation efforts, and its efforts in litigation, but its efforts at the state level as well, and their state through their state affiliates, I think is incredibly important for the future of the Second Amendment. And the NRA has been criticized, and rightfully so, for being lukewarm or maybe moderate on the Second Amendment. GOA casts itself as the no compromise group on the
or
Second Amendment.
FPC. I mean, they
Yes.
are in your face, kind of,
Yes.
which I enjoy.
Which I prefer, right? But the NRA, nevertheless, has significant influence, generally in a positive direction, for the right to keep and bear arms.
Yeah, and this issue about compromise, you talked to John Richardson about this, and I think he wants to move towards a more no compromise situation. But with that said, this is kind of my compromise. Sometimes compromise is a good thing. I can think of one instance, and that's the quote assault weapons ban, end quote, that went into effect under the Clinton administration. It had a sunset provision in it. That was a compromise the NRA made. But if that compromise hadn't been made and there hadn't been negotiations, we may have had an assault weapons ban that didn't sunset. So there are some situations where you might not want to take the 101% approach, but those are few and far between.
Yeah, and like you said, the sunset provision would not have been in there but for the NRA. But I think, with that being said, I think the reform-minded board of directors, the people who have been elected as reformers, are more of the pure-minded people toward the right to keep and bear arms. So I'm optimistic that the NRA will be moving more in that direction.
Yeah, and they're not going to be as much, the hunting crowd. And don't take that wrong. I'm not there's a place for hunting, but the Second Amendment is not about hunting. They're going to be focused more on hope. And we can talk about this because I don't understand. I don't know who a millennial is, or a Gen X, or a Gen Y, but I think the NRA is going to focus more on younger folks and get more younger folks involved. Can I make a point about, just real quick? I had 2 points, and given my feeble mind, I'll probably forget 2 before I get done with 1. But this issue about life membership, one of the things that why folks might want to consider a life membership is because, like, the 76th director was elected with less than 1,000 votes. Okay, I don't remember how many Charlie got.
I think it was around 300 or 400, probably.
So the 76th director is directed at the NRA annual meeting. You can go there and you can vote. NRA says there were about 70,000 people there, but to vote in that election, you have to be either a life member or above, or you have to be a annual member for 5 years in a row, I think it is. So if you get your life membership, you can vote in that meeting. And I think I would encourage folks to pay attention to that in coming years, because your vote means a lot. I mean, and think about that. In a organization where there are 3 million plus members, 300 and some odd of them decided who the 76th member was going to be.
Yeah, there were very few who decided who the 76th director would be. And like you said, you have to be an annual member for 5 years straight. You can get a 5-year membership as well, or a life member.
But there aren't very many organizations where you can have that much influence by actually exercising your right to vote.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, think about politics at the state and local level. You don't even have that much influence in those elections generally. So your vote really does matter, especially that vote that you cast at the NRA annual meeting for the 76th director.
Yeah. And one other thing before I forget that number two, because I actually remember it now. Why is the NRA important? And like I said, FPC is incredibly important. Second Amendment Foundation, those two organizations are primarily involved in litigation with respect to the Second Amendment. The GAO, Gun Owners of America,
GOA. Yeah.
GOA, is closer to the NRA in terms of its breadth of what it tries to do, but it's still not nearly as large. The NRA, you have to remember, I mean, it's involved in the ILA, is involved in legislative advocacy. They're involved in the courts. They have an enormous training organization involved in training. They're involved in competitive sports. Some of you are familiar with Friends of the NRA banquets. They're involved in youth sports. So they have an incredibly wide breadth. Think of that aircraft carrier. It's very wide. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What they do, very long. The things that they're engaged in are very broad. And it's important to understand it's a 3 or 4 million, member organization. And one of the things that the NRA does, and you pointed this out before in some of your other podcasts, it's not like a Bloomberg that's got a billionaire at the top who's going out and trying to recruit a few people to wear a red or whatever shirt they wear and go try to influence the legislature. This is a ground up organization. And because of that, they can go to a congressman or a state legislature and say, we have 3 million members, 4 million members, X hundreds of thousands in this state, and we can make an influence. We're going to influence this election because of our membership numbers. Yeah. And that's why the NRA, I think, is important because has such broad influence on the legislative process and just generally on advocating for the right to keep and bear arms in so many areas.
And if you want to get a better sense for the influence that the NRA has, I think it's a good idea actually to go and listen to some of the podcasts that we record at the NRA annual meeting, because we talked to the director of education and training, John Howard, and talked about the hundreds of thousands of instructors that they have and the number of people that they train every year in basic firearms handling and marksmanship, and the number of course offerings that the NRA has, and the quality of the curriculum that they have available to people. And then we talked to David Conti, who's with the NRA ILA, and all the things that they do and the representatives that they have in every state to influence the conversation around the right to keep and bear arms nationally and at the state level. And then also we talked to John Richardson, who was on the board of directors, and we talked to who was the director of the law enforcement training division, Glenn Hoyer, and the thousands of law enforcement instructors that they train. And so it's an incredible operation. They have huge influence in all sorts of areas outside of Washington, D.C. and outside of the legislative arena. So this is an organization that is unmatched in terms of its reach, in terms of its ability for training, legislation, and litigation.
And I think there's going to be more change coming. I'm not going to go into all of it, but you're going to talk to Ronald Andring here lately. He had a lot of influence at the meeting this year, an enormous amount of influence. I've got one of the,
and he's just a member of the NRA.
Yeah, he has enormous knowledge about the litigation that went on in New York. I'm sure you'll talk to him about that. He put forth a couple of resolutions, that one of which didn't pass, the other passed in an amended form, and I think that's going to have a great influence. He's really important voice for making sure we don't have any conflicts of interest in the future and transparency. And he had an enormous amount of positive influence, I think. And you'll get to talk to him some more about that. But
the episode I record with him will be the one that's released right after this episode. And he's the only member, in fact, that testified in the New York trial. So he's an incredibly engaged member, an incredibly knowledgeable member. I think sometimes a thorn in the side of many of the board members, but I think with good reason and for good cause. So you should certainly keep an eye out for that episode.
Yeah, and he's going to be involved with one of the board committees going forward. That was part of what the resolution, how it was amended, was to include him in the process. So I think that's a good thing, and look forward to that as well.
Yeah. As I mentioned, we recorded a number of episodes. This was our first time attending as press at the NRA annual meeting, and we recorded several episodes from the show floor. And I want to show you here on the screen just briefly where you can find most of those. We streamed those conversations live from the NRA annual meeting, and you can go to YouTube or Facebook to see those live streams. But now I am breaking that live stream up into separate segments and to allow people to listen to those segments separately. And I've created a playlist. If you go to the Forge of Freedom page on YouTube, I've created a playlist for the 2025 NRA annual meeting. All of those segments will be there. There are 4 released at this time. I think there will be 11 or 12 total by the time I've got them all broken up. So you can keep an eye out for those there. They'll also be released on Facebook, Rumble, X, and on podcast. And of course, you can also go to our website at forgeoffreedom.com to see the episodes there as they are released.
Yeah, I see David Yamani there. That I really enjoyed that. Of course, most of the interviews you did, but in terms of speaking of conflict of interest, obviously I have one. You're my son, and I'm biased. But I would encourage folks to go and listen to all of those because they're very good, very informative, and you can kind of pick and choose and break them down and listen to them when you want. Stephen Holbrook, for instance, and I'm going to give you another plug. I'm sorry. Stephen Holbrook was one of the interviews, who's a Second Amendment scholar, an attorney, litigated before the Supreme Court. He's got, matter of fact, I think he had oral argument this past week with the Fourth Circuit on a Second Amendment case. I was going to actually watch the oral arguments, didn't get a chance. I may look that up and watch the recording on YouTube. But I also want to say, Alex, you wrote an article. Alex regularly writes, is it monthly for Gun Digest?
Yes.
And the recent one, I think it was a cover story, actually. It's kind of a history of, I don't know, you can characterize it. The Second Amendment, it kind of is a synopsis of the Second Amendment litigation that's occurred in the Supreme Court. And I would also, if you can link to that, I think that law students ought to read it, but I also think it's written in a way that you don't have to be a lawyer, and it kind of just gives you a synopsis and helps you get through all the weeds about where we are with Second Amendment litigation and Second Amendment rights. So
I just put it up here on the screen. It's the article from May 8th, 2025. It will be published in the June issue of Gun Digest. It's called The Second Amendment from Founding Principle to Modern Battleground. And I run through the history of the Second Amendment, the rationale for its adoption, how the Second Amendment has evolved from applying to the federal government only and now to the states, and talk a little bit about Bruin and Rahimi, which are, of course, relatively new Supreme Court cases interpreting the Second Amendment, and just give some parting thoughts there about what's next.
But there's so many things out there, particularly I know on YouTube, I'll see things will come up and it's, what do they call it? Clickbait. It's like, breaking news. Well, there's really no this really no breaking news. People are just trying to get clicks, but this is a very succinct, well-written thing that'll give you basically a status of where we are.
And I joked that I get about 1,000 words in the column that I write, and that's about 1,000 words more than they teach in law school about the Second Amendment. This is a great, I think, resource for people to get acquainted with where the Second Amendment comes from and where it currently stands in terms of the Supreme Court's posture toward the interpretation of the Second Amendment. Yeah. So you can find a link to that through our website as well. You see, I put an article there, Gun Digest, the Second Amendment from Founding Principle to Modern Battleground. Find the Gun Digest article, the link to the Gun Digest article there, or go directly to gundigest.com and do a search there as well. So with that said, Mike, I want to mention a couple other interviews that we did that I was personally excited about because they were not directly gun-related episodes that we recorded at the NRA annual meeting. And that was one we recorded with Stephanie Heatherton, who is with the Tuttle Twins, and Ben Liebing, who was there for Hillsdale College. Stephanie was the regional director, or is the regional director for Tuttle Twins outreach in the southeastern region, I believe. And she was agreed. I asked her, many of these folks I asked ahead of the meeting to come on the podcast. She agreed sort of last minute to come on the podcast. And I really enjoyed that conversation because the Second Amendment is incredibly important, but the Tuttle Twins is focused on teaching young children primarily, but even adults can benefit from their books.
I'm on number 2 already. Enjoyed it,
Yeah, but teaching children and people in general the principles of liberty. And I think that that's incredibly important because the Second Amendment is, of course, the palladium of liberty, and it's there to help protect our freedom from tyrannical governments. But I think that a more important first step is to equip people with the ideas and the principles of liberty so that we never have to resort to the gun. And I think that Tuttle Twins is an incredible resource for that purpose because let's face it, children are not receiving this sort of education in government schools, often not in private schools.
Well, matter of fact, and so that means if you didn't get it as a child, you don't have it as an adult. Like I
Yeah,
said,
unless you seek it out on your own or
yeah.
you just happen to be lucky. I myself, I've given out a few of these sets as baby shower gifts. They have a toddler set, they have an elementary age set, they have a teenage set. They have guidebooks, questions to help ask questions about the content with your children. They have an online curriculum now that they're really expanding, and videos that go along with the books as well. So these are a great resource. Connor Boyack and Elijah Stanfield are the two men who are behind it primarily, but they've built up a great team. And this is, I'll just give you an example. This is the set that I bought at the meeting. The first book in the set is called The Law. And each of these books is basically a story, an illustrated story that helps children engage with the ideas of liberty in a fun way and in a memorable way. So definitely check those out.
Yeah, and I'll point out, like I said, I'm reading a couple of them. I'm not sure who they're. The ones I'm reading, are they for teenagers? Is that what
Yes,
they're high
yes,
school
yeah.
students? Maybe I don't
Mhm.
know exactly, but I mean, I'm reading them and I'm learning things out of them. But I wanted to, folks. I was a little bit. I'm always skeptical of reading anything that doesn't have footnotes to it. So these books, I'm starting to reading them, and I'm like, okay, I want to check some of the things they're saying. I'll do some independent research. It's been so far remarkable how accurate. I mean, they're not misleading. They're not kind of shaping things the way they want to from a particular perspective. I've been impressed so far that my independent research has corroborated what's in the books.
Yeah. Yeah. They're incredibly great. They're really good. I've listened to their podcast, How to Change the World, for years. It's an excellent podcast, very short, very to the point, excellent resource for education as well. But some people say, well, you're just indoctrinating your children with freedom, with the way you think. And I actually like this. I think that you're not indoctrinating them. You're basically protecting them from the onslaught of propaganda that they're going to receive. You're giving them the ideas to help defend against the propaganda they'll hear from the media, from government school teachers, and from the rest of the world.
Well, it's all about, to me, it's not necessary. It's about providing information, but it's about critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's about. You know,
Yeah.
it's the whole story about, do you teach a person to fish or do you give them fish?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you teach them to fish and then they'll be okay in getting their own fish. And that's
Yeah.
the same way with critical thinking. We want kids and adults to have critical thinking skills. And, you know, Aaron Sperling, our friend, decades ago, he said, you know, Aaron, I'm sorry if I screw up your representation, but something to the effect that he thought that all folks ought to take a logic course in junior high or something like that. And he has been so right. And I've become more committed to his notion over time, is that we need folks to be able to critical think. And then if you're exposed to Marxism, you can think about it. If you're exposed to John Locke, you can think about it. I'm confident if you have critical thinking skills, which way you're going to go.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's important to understand about introducing kids or young adults or old adults like me to these concepts, and just to make sure that our critical thinking is where it needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah. There's the common joke that if Marxists understood economics, they wouldn't be Marxists,
Yeah.
right? And so that's what this is about. Not just Marxism, but just being able to articulate the ideas of freedom and to think for yourself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'm fine. I mean, for instance, Tate's downstairs now. He's 16 months old, 17.
that's my son.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's Alex's son, my grandson. At some point, I hope he reads the Communist Manifesto and
Mm-hmm.
be perfectly comfortable with him reading the Communist Manifesto.
Right.
Perfectly willing to let him hear what MSNBC says or Fox or whomever in between. And it's about being able to sort through that and understand the propaganda, understand what you're being presented with, and being able to get through that.
Yeah, indeed. So Tuttle Twins, definitely go check that out. Podcasts, newsletter, books, videos, curriculum, all sorts of resources available there. And I told this in the podcast with Stephanie Heatherton, but ironically, a couple of years ago at the NRA annual meeting, a woman came up to us after a seminar and asked how you make sure your children don't become liberal progressives or Marxists or socialists or whatever. And I think that the way you do that is you teach them critical thinking at an early age. And it's hard to do that in a regimented way. So these stories are great at helping to do that, especially with children. The other episode that I want you to keep a special eye out for, because it's not Second Amendment related directly, is the conversation with Ben Liebing from Hillsdale. And Hillsdale, for people who don't know, is behind the Imprimis publication, which is a popular publication. But they're also one of the only colleges that does not take any federal funding. And of course, there's been a lot of disagreement in the news recently about whether or not Harvard should get certain federal funding or not. And Hillsdale just does not have to worry about that because they have never accepted a dime of federal funding. And for that reason has lots of autonomy, and they're free from the puppet strings of the federal government. And they I think augment this sort of education that you would get through the Tuttle twins in extending this sort of classical education, this education that really emphasizes the why and the how, not the what to think. They're not just teaching you to be a parrot and to repeat information. They're teaching you how to think about information and to figure out the why, or to help you figure out the why. And so I think that Hillsdale is a great resource. Even if your child or you don't go to Hillsdale College, they have lots of great resources and podcasts and books and online. They have online courses now about history and the Constitution and other great resources as well. As a matter of fact, they stocked us up on pocket constitutions while we were down there. So definitely a great resource as well. So many people, I think there are, of course, flaws with the Constitution. It's not a perfect document, but it's amazing what the founders knew when they drafted the Constitution about history, about the tendencies of people who come to power, about the tendencies of government to enlarge itself and to become tyrannical over time. And I think that if more people read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, I think that people would come to appreciate the wisdom and maybe heed the wisdom that the founders had when they drafted that document.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing how many people haven't read the Declaration. Of course, the Declaration of Independence is not part of the Constitution, but haven't read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And it's interesting because we had a conversation with David Yamani, Professor David Yamani, and he wrote an article. I can't remember the title of the article, but it expressed his concerns with some of the executive actions that Donald Trump has taken since he went into office. And he's got some concerns with that. And I understand his concerns. And I agree with him in some respects, probably disagree with him in others. But you can't have that conversation unless you're a critical thinker, like Professor Yamani is, and you understand the documents themselves. I mean, we were talking about executive unitary power, okay? It's a complicated thing, but just start with the Constitution and read the plain words.
Yeah.
I found getting ready for that interview, I just went through it, and I think you remember, I just highlighted some stuff in the Constitution, and look at the plain meaning at first and just read the thing.
And you won't get the wisdom that's captured by the Constitution by just a simple read. You have to engage with it. You have to ask why did they do that? And I think if you are actively engaged in reading the Constitution and you ask why, I think you'll find, and it will lead you down a path to this wisdom and this theory of government that's encapsulated in the Constitution.
Yeah, and I think it's important. This kind of goes back to Professor Yamani's concerns. I think it's important that you read it, not just so you can understand that you're being pummeled with propaganda from the quote left, end quote, but frankly, we're promulgated with propaganda from the right. And there, I think, sometimes stepping over the bounds that the Constitution intended. And yeah, I might be okay with a guy I like doing something, but if it's over the bounds of the Constitution, I've got to worry about setting a precedent for the next president or the next governor or the next whatever that gets in power and then can abuse the power that they really don't have but have gotten just because of the exercise of the power.
I think in some ways the right's ignorance of and their basically ignoring of the Constitution, I think, is more insidious than the left, because the left doesn't even pretend to follow the Constitution. They say that it's a living document. They don't even care.
Yeah.
It's outdated. Some old dudes from a long time ago wrote it. They don't even pretend to care about it. The right pretends to care about it. They take lots of actions under the pretense of the Constitution that are entirely unconstitutional, and I think that that undermines the Constitution in an even more insidious way. And so you're right. I think that you have to be. I think you should read it and think about the why behind it, because we are inundated with propaganda from left and right in ignoring the Constitution.
And it's part of that critical thinking. Sometimes the right may be doing something that's
Yeah.
wrong.
Yep.
So,
Indeed. All right. Well, I want to, like I said, you know where to find those interviews. I'm releasing those piecemeal. 4 of those have been released already. I want to just make some closing thoughts here, Mike, about the NRA annual meeting and any other thing you want to get to. Of course, as you mentioned earlier, the reports are that there were somewhere over 70,000 in attendance. That seems high to me, just based on my perception of people who were on the show floor. It was still well attended. It seems like a stretch that there were 70, but nevertheless, there were a decent number of people in attendance. There's some mixed feedback I've been reading online from vendors about how well their booths were attended. I'm not sure, but I'm hoping to see the meeting reinvigorated in the years to come.
yeah, I'm too am skeptical about this. No basis whatsoever, except my own notions of attending it for years and years and years and years. But I'm a little bit skeptical of the 70,000. One thing that is of a little bit of concern to me, and we haven't talked about, we talked about the election and the board of directors and the politics and the interviews we did in Media Row, which I understand was a success. But a lot of people attend this just to go look at the guns and gadgets. We didn't have a chance to do that much, but there's 14 acres of stuff, basically firearms related, guns and gadgets. I was a little concerned because feedback from these vendors, it's the gun manufacturers or the ancillary equipment. I'm a little concerned that maybe it's not being attended enough by enough people that it warrants them investing. I don't know what the booth space costs, but I'm a little concerned about vendors not coming back because of that cost benefit analysis that's going on there. So I would encourage people to attend in the future, particularly if you're a gun and gadget guy. I didn't get to look at a lot of stuff. I did note, I think I could be wrong about this because I didn't have time to walk around much. But for instance, I always go by the Galco booth, the holster manufacturers. I don't think they were there, but they could have been. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Leupold, Leupold, the optics manufacturer. I don't think they were there. I usually go by their booth. So there seems to be some shift in attendance, just at least a little bit. That's just my opinion and my perception. And I hope folks continue to attend in the future so that it makes sense for these folks to keep coming.
And my perception is that this is a multi-part problem. Obviously, Trump was elected. I think people are more apathetic about their rights because they don't perceive that there's a threat, or at least an immediate threat to their right to keep and bear arms. So it's not like, sometimes people say that Obama was the greatest gun salesman of all time, and that I think that may be true. But when there's a tendency when there's a president who is relatively friendly to the right to keep and bear arms to be more apathetic about the right. So people don't show for that reason. Then the economy seems to be stagnating to some degree. That may be part of it. And then, of course, the internal issues with the NRA may also be part of it as well. So I think that there's a multi-part problem here. But nevertheless, there was a decent turnout. But you're right, there's this problem. Is it good enough for the vendors to continue to invest their dollars to be there?
And I would encourage people to come. I mean, like I said, we didn't spend a lot of time with guns and gadget. I'm kind of interested in a red dot for a pistol. So I did. It's a great place to go, and you can look at everything. I went to the Trijicon booth. I went to the Aimpoint booth. You can look at and compare and contrast. It's hard to do that at a local retailer. Now you can't buy guns there and not very much stuff, but you can, it's a good way to go and compare and contrast products. That's about all
Yeah,
I looked at that new. I don't even know what it's called. The Ruger X.
it's their Glock clone.
Their Glock 3 clone. Pretty impressive, actually. There, I mean, you can't shoot it, but obviously, but pretty impressive. So it's just it was an opportunity for me to just to walk by there, put my hands on it, see what it's like, and move on. So I'd encourage people to, that's important. And then the educational content is exceptional as well. So encourage people to attend. I think next year it's in Houston.
That's right.
I don't know what the dates are. And then I think I've heard, I've not seen this confirmed from the NRA, it may be in Orlando the following year. I hope it comes back to Indianapolis soon because, quite frankly, once again, I'll disclose my bias being a Hoosier. I think Indianapolis is, from an attendee standpoint, it is the best place to have the NRA convention.
Yeah, I've not been to a better place for the NRA convention.
And I suspect they'll be back to Indianapolis again, but it may be Houston, maybe then Orlando. I'm sure it's Houston's the next year, but the following year, maybe Orlando.
Indianapolis is the crossroads of America where so many interstates intersect, and decent airport, great convention, great hotel layout. It's just a fantastic event venue. So hopefully it's back there soon. But you're right, it's in Houston next year. You actually, if you're a member, you can go for no additional cost. Admission is included as part of your membership, but you can also pay a fee. Right.
This year, I think
to enter.
I think this is the first time they've ever done that. Before, you had to be a member and you could join outside and then go in. But this year, I think they charge $10 for anybody to attend for all 3 days.
Yeah, you don't have to be a member necessarily to attend. And I don't know, but I expect that they'll do that next year as well in Houston. And Houston's a decent venue as well. I think it was not particularly well attended the last time it was in Houston, but that was right after. That was the first one after COVID. And there was a shooting, I believe it was Uvalde, right before the meeting in Houston.
And I enjoyed the Houston one. I think I like Dallas a tad better, maybe, but Houston's really good. So I look forward to that already, and it'll be here before you know it.
Yeah, and like you said, the educational content available at the NRA annual meeting is worth way more than the cost of a membership. I mean, it's fantastic. The number of seminars you can attend from really reputable and knowledgeable people is fantastic. Attend for whether it's the gear and the gadgets or for the educational content or both. It's a great opportunity.
But don't expect to do it in a day. I mean,
no,
it
you really need two at least.
And I would spend all three.
Yeah, especially if you want the gear and the education.
Absolutely. Because some of the seminars, I don't think, who am I thinking of now?
Well, there were a few missing this year. John Correa was not there, I heard, because he had a trial as an expert witness. Ed Monk was not there. He was, I think, out west somewhere. And I know he was at a Girl and a Gun, but that was after the NRA annual meeting.
And then West Point professor Dave Grossman wasn't there. He gives a 3 or 4 hour seminar traditionally there. Mm-hmm. So that tells you how much time you can spend on the educational portion.
Yeah, so there were a few big names missing, but there were still a lot of great opportunities for education there.
Glenn Hoyer gave a seminar. He was giving seminars. You had him on. He was giving seminars as well. So anyway, that's honestly the best value that you get is the educational seminars that are all free.
Yeah. And I'm not for sure yet, but there is another conference coming up in August. GOALS, GOA is putting on their second annual GOALS conference, which is a lot like the NRA annual meeting. I haven't been. Last year was their first one. I may get to go this year. I'm not sure yet. But that has similar opportunities, but not nearly as big as the NRA annual meeting, and that's going to be in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Yeah, and I think they've got stuff online now. You can get information about that and see who the vendors are and some of the education, and get some information about that. You can just go to their website.
Yeah, so I'd encourage people to check that out as a possible opportunity as well. All right, Mike. Well, any other thoughts before we close out the episode here? We're running up on close to an hour and don't want to make this too long-winded, but
I would just encourage folks to either watch Alex's videos on YouTube, and frankly, you don't need to watch them. You can listen to them in a podcast form. And I really, really can't emphasize enough, if you want to understand where we are with the Second Amendment now, read that 1,000 word article, and that'll save you a lot of time and be very efficient.
All right. Well, thanks again, Mike, for joining the show. It's been a while since you've been in the studio here, and it's good to chat again with you, and hope everybody enjoyed the episode. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. And if you're watching by podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcast, if you could give us a review, that also helps us with those platforms. As always, you can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, X, and at forgeoffreedom.com. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.